In the years after the Civil War, Jesse James emerged as really one of the most famous outlaws of the 1800s. This is a guy who had been hardened by his experience in the Civil War, as a Confederate guerrilla running with guys like Bloody Bill Anderson. And throughout the 1870s, Jesse James kind of became, like a little bit of a folk hero. He was kind of like this Confederate avenger during the Reconstruction era, who was like a Robin Hood who took from the rich and gave to the poor. At least that's how he was portrayed in the press. Well, as the 1880s set in, Jesse James's situation had changed a little bit. For one, his old gang had kind of fallen apart. The younger brothers had been shot up and were in prison, and he had kind of fallen out with his brother Frank, and he had come back to where I am today, in St. Joseph, Missouri, to try and put together a new gang and restart his career as an outlaw. But things weren't going to go so well for Jesse James, and a man who lived by the sword was going to die by the sword in this house right here. Dadgum. Well, as you can tell, it is windy as heck today here in St. Joseph, Missouri. And as I said, we are here at the home of Jesse James. You can see here on their sign out front, it says where Jesse James was killed. So as I mentioned, Jesse James had kind of moved around as an outlaw. And in the beginning of the 1880s, he and his wife and two children moved back to Missouri and came here to St. Joseph, and were living under an assumed name. And this was probably not the best place to come back to, because the governor of Missouri at the time, a guy by the name of Governor Crittenden, had basically declared war on all outlaws and had put a $10,000 bounty on the head of Jesse James and the outlaws that were in his gang. And as I mentioned, James was trying to kind of like rebuild a gang and kind of resume his career as an outlaw. And there were a couple of guys in his crew that he probably should not have trusted. All right, so we're going to go inside here and take a look at the home where Jesse James was killed. All right, making our way up the stairs here to the Jesse James house, and man, this wind is just an absolute beast today. Now, one thing that we should mention about this house, let's see, they got a sign up here. Oh yeah, they actually mentioned what I was going to say. So here it says Jesse James home. Outlaw Jesse James was shot and killed in this house on April 3rd, 1882. It was then at 1318 Lafayette on the hill above Patey House, and was moved here in 1977. So we're going to go in here and take a look around, but just keep in mind that this house has been moved, but it is the original house. So we just got into the house here, and right off the bat, they have all kinds of cool artifacts that are tied to Frank and Jesse James in some way. Now, this isn't the exact revolver that was carried by Jesse James, but this is a .36 Colt that is very much like what he would have had. They do have some things that are authentic artifacts that belong to Frank and Jesse, like this rattlesnake necktie that was worn by Frank James. So that's pretty wild. They also have a shaving mug that belonged to Jesse James. These are some shoes that were worn by Frank James. And then over here, now they have a little Smith & Wesson revolver that, now this is not like a replica or one that was like what they would have used. This is the actual revolver that was owned by Frank James. So that is just pretty darn interesting. Okay, so this is a really small house, only 4 rooms here, at least on this level, and I've just moved into the front room. So by 1882, like I said outside, there wasn't much of Jesse James's gang left, so he was kind of trying to rebuild a gang. And 2 guys that were basically on this new crew were Bob and Charlie Ford. They were brothers. And on the morning of April 3rd, 1882, all 3, Bob and Charlie and Jesse James, were right here in this very room. And this is where Jesse James was going to experience his final moments. So again, this is the front room where Bob and Charlie Ford and Jesse James were planning another robbery. And as I had mentioned before, Governor Crittenden had actually secretly met with Bob Ford and had arranged for Bob Ford to either turn Jesse James in or kill him for a reward. The problem was the brothers were afraid of Jesse James because he was always armed. Well, on the morning of April 3rd, he had taken off his jacket, and he had also taken off his gun belt so he didn't alert the neighbors. And as they were sitting here in this room, Jesse James happened to look up at this piece of framed needlework that was either off kilter. I've also heard that there was dust that he was going to clean off of it. And he stood up on a chair to fix it. And from this spot, Bob and Charlie Ford stood up and pointed their guns at him. And Bob Ford is the one who actually pulled the trigger and shot Jesse James in the back of the head. He, of course, was immediately killed. There was kind of a legend there for a while that this was the bullet hole, and over a period of years people picked at it and took souvenirs. That was probably just a coincidence. The bullet likely didn't exit his skull. But something else that's interesting is if you look right here on the floor, you notice there's a bunch of pieces of the floorboard that look to have been carved out. Well, that was where there were some blood stains from Jesse James. And then over the years, souvenir hunters, hacked out pieces of the floor to take home for themselves. But pretty crazy to be standing right here in this very spot where on April 3rd, 1882, one of the most famous outlaws of all time was killed by Bob Ford. They also have a few pictures here that show what the Jesse James home would have looked like in 1882. So here's a crowd that is gathered at his home on April 3rd, the day that he died. And then, of course, the house was moved and then was moved back here. And also in this room, they have some artist depictions Jesse James. Now, there was an urban legend that the person who was killed was not really Jesse James, and you always hear stories like this, how he, maybe escaped and, lived to be an old man or things like that. Well, in 1995, they actually exhumed the body of Jesse James to do some DNA testing. This is something that the family wanted to do, and they found out that the person in the grave was, in fact, Jesse James. Now, here is what is really crazy. What you're looking at here are different artifacts that came out of the grave. So here is broken glass from the coffin viewing glass. They also have wood fragments from the coffin of Jesse James, and also the coffin handles, which is just absolutely crazy. But something else, I mentioned that Jesse James was a Confederate guerrilla with like Bloody Bill Anderson. Well, he had been shot a couple of times during the Civil War, and there is a .36 caliber round ball that was recovered from the chest area in the casket that was kind of in the lung area of Jesse James. And then they also have this tie pin that you can see in his funeral photo. That is absolutely wild. Okay, here is something else that is pretty crazy. Whenever they exhumed Jesse James's body in 1995, they took a casting of his skull and also of his teeth. And on this casting, as it rotates around, you can actually see where the entrance hole of the bullet was for the skull. So there's no exit, so it probably lodged right behind his eye. But man, oh man. All right, and just real quick, this is the bedroom of the Jesse James home. Now, something about this whole story that you do have to have some empathy is that whenever Jesse James was killed, his wife and 2 young kids were in the house as well. So whenever the gunshot went off, his wife rushed into the room, and the Ford brothers said that it was an accidental discharge, and then they escaped from the house. One other quick thing before I leave this house that I thought was just kind of funny. This is a love seat, and you'll notice that there is a piece of the back that is missing on one side. Well, that's not an accident. This was by design. The man would sit right here on the area with the back, and then the woman would not have any back support, so would be required to lean on the shoulder of the man who was sitting next to her. That is kind of sneaky. Okay, that was pretty wild to actually be standing in the very spot where one of the most famous outlaws of all time was murdered by Bob Ford. Absolutely crazy. Okay, so we're gonna go ahead and get back out into the wind here and jump in the Jeep and head down the road to the final resting place of Jesse James. Now, after the death of Jesse James, his wife and kids were pretty much left destitute. This guy who had robbed so many trains and banks and everything really had no money to his name. So his wife ended up having to sell off almost all of their belongings and a lot of his stuff in order to make ends meet for her and the kids. And photographers were selling pictures of Jesse James's corpse as souvenirs. And as we mentioned in a previous video, he was originally buried out on the old home place, but was later exhumed and moved out to this location right here at Mount Olivet Cemetery in Kearney. I'm out here looking for Jesse James's grave and happened to come across this one for Richard Sims Jr., who was a veteran of the Revolutionary War, and then I guess came out to Missouri and passed away in 1850. Wasn't expecting to find a Revolutionary War veteran's grave, but that is pretty cool. Now, in a previous episode of History Traveler, we talked about an incident that occurred at the home of Jesse and Frank's mother, where the Pinkerton Detective Agency showed up and threw a bomb through their window that ended up killing their half-brother. Well, here's the grave of Archie P. Samuel. It says, killed by a bomb, January 26th, 1875. Here is the grave of Frank and Jesse's mother, Zerelda Samuel, who was injured in that same blast and lost an arm. And next to her lies one of the most notorious outlaws in American history, Jesse James. So if you look at his grave marker here, it says Jesse W., born September 5th, 1847, assassinated April 3rd, 1882. And then they have his military marker here as well, Jesse W. James, Taylor's Squad, Todd's Company, Quantrill's Regiment, CSA, and then it has his date of birth and his date of death. So yeah, there's the grave of Jesse James. Want to be careful that we're not, celebrating Jesse James. I know that he was kind of celebrated by people, some people during his time, but this was a guy who was a brutal man and committed some really terrible atrocities. But anyway, here's the grave of Jesse James. All right, got one more that we're going to go take a look at here. After the death of Jesse James, things didn't go so great for the Ford brothers. They tried, taking a tour where they reenacted the assassination of Jesse James. It played well in some places and really, really bad in others. Charlie ended up committing suicide a couple of years after by shooting himself in the chest. And Robert Ford tried to earn a living like posing for pictures and branding himself as the man who killed Jesse James. Turned out people weren't too fond of the fact that he had basically shot a guy in cowardice in the back of the head. So he ended up moving west and was in Creede, Colorado, where he had set up a saloon. And a guy by the name of Ed O'Malley walked in one day and had a double-barrel shotgun, walked up to Ford and said, "Hello, Bob," and then unloaded both barrels on him and killed Robert Ford. And he is buried right here in Richmond, Missouri. All right, well, here is the final resting place of the man who shot Jesse James. And dang, that is a pretty simple headstone. And then down here you can see it says Bob Ford, born December 8th, 1841, died June 8th, 1892. The man who shot Jesse James. Huh. All right, well, there you go. There is the final resting place of Bob Ford. I don't think things really turned out the way that Bob really hoped that they would turn out. But whenever you befriend a guy and are planning to do a robbery with him, and then, well, shoot the guy in the back of the head whenever he's unarmed, you can't be surprised whenever people are going to view that as an extreme act of cowardice. But anyway, kind of a sad ending for both figures. But anyway, had an interesting day today, being able to go around, look at the place where Jesse James was assassinated, and then be able to visit these graves and learn a little bit more about one of the most notorious outlaws in U.S. history. We are constantly exploring and learning new things on this channel, so if you found value in this video, be sure to subscribe and click the notification bell to catch all of the new content when it comes out. And be sure to check the links in the description for more content and opportunities from our partners.